Hey guys, how's it going? I'm Jen with one N. And if you're like me, you're watching Atheist Edge.
Last night, you said no one in this room is a Christian. I think I'm almost verbatim. You said no one in this room is a Christian because God doesn't exist. And forget about the Jesus mythicism thing. Let's just go with God himself doesn't exist. And since your whole basis is false, no one in this room can be a Christian. I would have a point of contention with that, and I'll draw a parallel. Biologically, race doesn't exist. We're all Homo sapiens sapien. So biologically, scientifically, there is no such thing as race, but there are racists. So by that line of logic, even if there weren't a Christ, or at the very least a God, wouldn't half the room last night have been Christian, even still?
Well, now, there's two senses of the word Christian. On the one hand, there's a social group of people who gather and do things together, and they use the label Christian. Now, that group exists. There are Christians in the sense of we call ourselves Christians because we do these activities.
By label only.
We believe these sorts of things. But are you a Christian in the theological sense? That is, you are Christ's beloved. You take up his name because he loves you. Christ loves you. God sent him to die for your sins on the cross, and that you're going to be redeemed, be brought to heaven. That's sort of a sense. There are no Christians.
That makes sense. What James Walker, one of the founders of the book club, he said, and he said this before. We know that 95% of Mark is found in Matthew, 65% of Mark is found in Luke. So James says, when it's word for word copied and pasted like that, he accuses atheists of mocking that because it looks too copied. It looks too cribbed. It couldn't have been independent testimonies. But then where they differ, we call it contradiction. So it's like they can't win for losing. And he feels frustrated that we're going to mock it either way. As far as the Gospels being either copied or outright contradicting.
Well, you would expect differences. Let's just state it straightforwardly. If there are 4 accounts of the life of Jesus, you would expect differences. You simply, you can't have 4 Gospels that use all the same words all the way through, because then there's only actually one Gospel. And 3 copied the Gospel. So you would expect differences. We have to expect differences, right? But what we don't expect is so much copying.
Word for word.
Now, not just the sayings, and but the descriptions of Jesus going from, say, Galilee to Jerusalem, and then he went down and blah 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 blah. You would have to pull up the text to see that. But in the Greek, even the descriptions of his travels are the same in like Mark, and then transferred to Matthew and Luke in many cases. So there's obviously plagiarism going on there. Okay, that's odd and it's strange. Why would you do that? What are you copying? Why are you copying? Why don't you have your own account? Why do we need a copied gospel? That is you got plagiarism. You plain outright.
But is that a damning? Is that an indictment? Because a Christian like James would say, well, he's just. Of course, Matthew. We know Matthew didn't write Matthew. The consensus says Matthew didn't write Matthew. Half this room last night thinks Matthew wrote Matthew. But let's just give them the benefit of the doubt. This guy Matthew, we know he had to have read Mark because he copied it word for word.
In places,
Their contention is that, of course, he read Mark. And instead of just wording it on his own, he just took 95% of Mark and then he just added what he remembers.
Well, the difference is, okay, so first off, there's plagiarism. On the other hand, the differences matter. One difference I'd like to point out, and I was talking to Richard Carey about it, he loves it too, is that in Matthew's Gospel, each Gospel wanted to bolster the claims that the previous Gospel made, and if there was an embarrassment, it wanted to clarify the embarrassment. And there's several passages like that. One in Mark is some guy comes up to Jesus and say what good teacher, what must I do, or something like that. And Jesus says, why do you ask me what's good? But in Matthew, I think it goes on, Jesus says, there's only one good but God. You know, he wanted to make sure that, he wanted to clarify that I wasn't, you know, calling myself the good one, you know, but God is good.
And isn't he calling himself not God in that too?
Yeah. Yeah.
It seems like he is.
And then, the claims that he was God became more and more.
That was in Matthew?
Yes, I believe
Yeah,
so.
Christology was very low in Matthew, because he would never have said such a thing in John. he admits fully that he's God in John.
Exactly. So the claims that Jesus is God became more and more pronounced. The claims that he had bodily resurrection became more and more pronounced. I mean, in John's gospel, he's found eating fish, you know, with his disciples. See, and he says, "See, I have a body." So the tombstone became bigger and bigger, and shinier and newer, and you know, things like that. They kept growing. So the differences matter, because what we see in these differences, and you know, obviously I don't have my book before me because I highlight many of them. And these differences evolve over and over to make stronger the case that Mark left out. Like in Mark's gospel, what we have is an unbelievable story that the women were there and at the tomb, and they were greeted by a man in white, I think. See, I need the text if we're going to discuss this, but
Yeah, first was just a single boy, right?
a man
With white clothes.
a person in white, and it says he's risen. Now go tell people in Galilee. That's what it says, right? And so the women went away in fear and told nobody.
No, and that's where it stops.
Are you serious? So you have to write another gospel to correct that. In fact, you have to have a longer ending in Mark to correct that.
16:9 through 20 was added later.
So they start correcting things along the way. So these differences matter, and and so then we get to the John's gospel, and you have high Christology, Jesus, you know, is the Word in the flesh, and so those differences do matter, because on the one hand you have plagiarism. That's nothing new. I mean, why are you doing that? On the other hand, these differences reveal something that is important about the gospel trajectories, and especially with the resurrection story itself. Chris earlier in the program was talking about some of the discrepancies. You know, when did the tomb get rolled back? Who was there? What did they say? Who did they meet? Where did they go? And one account says they stayed in Galilee. The other one says go to, or they stayed in Jerusalem. The other one says go to Galilee. These wouldn't amount to a hill of beans in a courtroom with under cross-examination. They say, well, what actually happened then? We want to know. Just get them all together. You know, I can just imagine getting all these testimonies together, if they exist. Now, the testimonies exist, because what we don't have eyewitnesses. What we have are these documents speaking on behalf of the so-called eyewitnesses. But if you were to get these eyewitnesses in a room, then you would ask them all these questions, and you'd say, well, you'd go away, you walk away. Well, what's going on here? Because they certainly aren't telling the same story.
I wasn't even going to ask this, but you made me think of, as far as Christology and how it heightens throughout the Gospels, Jesus' original last words were, why did you forsake me, basically? Like, why are you doing this to me? He's crying out as a man, right? Then it grows until we get to John, and I guess there's 7 last words, and Christians love to just lump them all together like he said all of them at the same time.
All right, saying number 1, everybody. Just to get this one in, saying number 2.
You know, that leads you to wonder, which of those 7 did he say last? So what were his final words? But in Mark, it ends with, oh my God, why have you forsaken me? Then it goes to, unto your hands I commend my spirit. So yes, 7 that they all want to conglomerate and just call it Jesus' final statement. But we can see throughout the Gospels, he gets more and more godlike, and it ends with him saying, just bowing his head in resignation and saying it is finished. That's all I wanted to. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, but it starts out with him whining like a little bitch. Obviously a man, and then, you know, by the end, he just accepting that he's a god and just saying, "Oh, it's finished. Yeah, it's going to all come to pass now."
Yeah, and another thing that probably needs to be mentioned with regard to these Gospels is that most scholars believe that Jesus spoke in Aramaic, the language of the land, although Greek was probably the universal language of some sort. So Jesus obviously uses Aramaic phrases it's still quoted that way in the Gospel. So, what would an Aramaic Gospel look like? Some say that Matthew wrote one. We don't have that. But that Gospel would be different. And what we find is in Mark's Gospel, it's Greek. Except for a few phrases. Yeah, except for a few phrases. Yeah. So we have a translation problem. I mean, there's words that would be different, and how you tell the tale would be different. So they start out with Mark. Okay, well, I want to know what was the gospel before Mark, or what was the gospel? What would the gospel have been written like?
The verbal tradition prior to that.
Well, the verbal tradition spread.
Mm-hmm.
So some verbal traditions got to Mark, and some didn't.
Some didn't.
And some got to somewhere else. And if they were to have written a gospel in that somewhere else place, it would look different than Mark.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't know how much different, but I'm sure it'd be different. It may be significantly different. We don't know.
Also, last night, you mentioned after Judas died, because you mentioned 11 apostles, and you caveated that by you explained that by saying, well, this is after Judas's death. But if I remember right, I haven't even gone back and checked myself since last night, but didn't Judas get replaced by another 12th?
Yeah.
It was like Bartholomew, or they added another one.
Matthias, I think.
Oh, Matthias. Okay. So in the Gospels, what we think is a contradiction and then he revealed himself to the 12. I don't know what verse that is, but that was after Judas's death, and they say, no, that's not a contradiction because they added this other dude later. So what do you think? When was this 12th? Do we even know when the 12th was added, if he really was added?
Well, we don't know how or when Judas died. It says he went out from the crucifixion and died.
So sometime
but
after.
Then later in Acts it says he hung himself. I mean, and we don't know when Matthias was added or why.
Right. There's no way of knowing the timeline there. We just know Judas had to have killed himself after the resurrection, and
they couldn't get the story straight though. I mean,
they had to have replaced him before they wrote that part about the 12 for that not to be a contradiction.
Well, no, I think we have to have the Bible before us to discuss this reasonably. So I think that Paul said that, the 12 disciples.
Oh, okay. Then that's plenty of time.
Which would have been before that was written.
Post-crucifixion.
I mean, if that's the case.
Yeah. Does it seem to you, it seems like this to me, I'm 51 years old. When I was younger, faith meant leap of faith, walk by faith, not by sight. It meant something unique and spiritual that was unique only to the Bible. And it meant something closer to knowing without evidence. You say that now to the apologist, and they scoff at you like, nah, it's never been that way. It's always meant trust and confidence. And just like I asked last night to Travis, if it only means confidence now, are you not, one, totally stripping faith of its unique biblical qualities, and two, making it redundant to even use? Why can't we just use confidence instead and just discard the damn word to begin with?
I have nothing to add. I'm dropping my mic on that. I mean, that's exactly right. You got that right, exactly.
Have you seen a progression in this apologetics have reformed in just the last couple decades?
Look, the average Christian and the average pastor will use faith as Paul described it. We walk by faith, not by sight. We don't see the way ahead of us. If we had faith, a mountain could be lifted and cast into the sea. The verses in there that faith is the substance of things hoped for.
Hebrews 11:1.
Faith is the substance. Faith is the foundation, basically. If I remember right from my studies, faith is the foundation of the things we hope for. Well, not evidence, you see. I mean, it's clear as day there. And so, what they do, because of people like you and me and others, where we question what faith can actually mean, given what you just said earlier, they have to redefine faith. And they have, successfully, I would have to add, done that in their community. That's a community of apologists. It still hasn't trickled down to the average people, because you'll find church signs, marquees that say, we walk by faith, not by sight, or faith has its own reasons. And I think that's a quote from Blaise Pascal. Faith has reasons that the reason knows nothing of. Oh no, it's the heart, but the heart would substitute for the word faith.
Yep.
And so these kinds of things, there used to be a virtue when they had a monopoly on the media and the conversation. But now they're actually using faith as evidence. They're using faith as if it's reason. Faith is equivalent to reason. And if that's the case, why bother with the word, right? Exactly.
It makes it redundant.
And not only that, but the church people don't get it. Everybody I talk to, the average person, and I've got a lot of friends that are Christians, and I remember having one conversation with a guy named Todd, and I was asking him some of the questions they do, and he's a great guy. He looked at me and smiled like that deer in the headlight.
No blinking.
He said, "But John, you just have to have faith." You know, as if that's going to solve all the questions, right? Now, you don't have to worry about the questions. You got to have faith. That's using it in a different way than these apologists want to define it. So the message hasn't gotten down to the rank and file yet, by far.
Yeah, and it gets worse because faith is supposed to have salvific qualities in the Bible. They're saved through faith. But if faith is confidence, you can have varying degrees of confidence, but you can't have varying degrees of salvation. So, like, is there a percentage of, like, what percentage of confidence gets you saved? Is it 50% confidence in the gospel? Is it 80, 20?
Perfect.
Should people be concerned they don't have enough faith to be saved?
Perfect.
3 years ago when we started this channel, I used to ask Christians, I'm going to give you 3 words. You tell me which one faith is most closely synonymous with. Hoping, knowing, or guessing. Right? And they would, just 3 years ago. So this is a fairly rapid paradigm shift with the Christian apologetics. Because 3 years ago, the most common answer was hoping. Now, I ask the same thing, and they refuse to answer. I can tell they want to say knowing. So then I added a 4th one. So now when I ask the question, I ask hoping, knowing, guessing, or trusting. And immediately they gravitate to trusting.
Yeah.
As if trusting is not also kind of knowing. You got to have a little bit of knowing to have trusting, right?
Yeah, I don't even like the word. I don't even like to use the word faith because of how they've used it, you know, and how they've tried to redefine it. I like hoping. I like hoping better. I like trusting. Use the words that are appropriate. I like to use the word opinion, knowledge. I like to think in terms of probabilities. I don't always specify the probabilities, but I'll use words sometimes. I'll try to use words like not probable, or slightly probable, or moderately probable, or you know, more probable than not, or you know, maybe extremely probable, or virtually certain. So I have the ranges of things, but faith has no. It has nothing. I don't like using the word because if it's used the way Christians normally use it, then that's not me. I have no faith at all, because if faith is without evidence, is how the normal Christian uses it.
Not anymore, though.
I know. Then I'm not interested in using it, and I'm not willing to grant the apologist redefinition of faith either by saying faith is trust. You know, I've just used the word trust. So I don't like using the word because it's on one hand something I don't have. On the other hand, I'm giving in to an equivocation where they've taken the word and redefined it another way. It's like Orwell's doublespeak. Mm-hmm. It's like changing words, the meaning of words, and that's all.
Secretly, just to, yep.
So I don't use the word faith. I don't like to use it. I like to use the word belief. I like to use like this is my conclusion, not this is my belief. I like to use the word like I give my assent to this. It's just, I understand what that word can mean. Like, it just means I acknowledge this as my, I agree with this. Mm-hmm. But I would rather just say I agree with that.
There was another time last night that I was dying to chime in, but other people were explaining. The Christians seemed, the analogy of Travis sitting in the chair came up, and the evidence for him sitting in the chair, I think you originally brought it up. So we have, you know, you're describing evidence that we can know you're sitting in that chair, and they were trying to conflate that with evidence, you know, the new apologetic for, you know, definition of faith, meaning we have just as much evidence for these things. We use faith with evidence for the Bible, and they equated it with sitting in the chair. I wanted to say there's a huge difference because, well, one's historical. We already talked about historical. It's just varying levels of probability. Travis sitting in that chair, that's right now. So not even just empirically, we can use our eyeballs. We can go over there and touch him. so we can use empirical. But we can also take Travis and that chair to the nearest physics lab, measure his mass and his density. I mean, we could measuring. What I'm getting at is biblical faith, or whatever context they want to put it in, whatever evidence they have. It's not testable. It's not repeatable. Falsifiability is a huge thing too. You got to give me some criteria in which whatever your claim could be falsified. If you can't give me a falsifiability factor, yeah, I can't see it as legitimate.
Well, like having taught introduction to philosophy classes, what we do in our classes is we try to help people understand that you might be wrong about everything. And you might be wrong, Travis is actually in the room. And and what we do is to tear down their certainty factors, as much as possible. And philosophers, are good at that. You might be dreaming right now.
Brain in a vat, simulation theory.
Exactly. You might be. He might be a hallucination. He might be a superimposed computer like on Star Wars.
You're under
help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Or you're under the
what's
influence
that
of
called?
some mind-altering.
Yeah, right. So they say they'll use those things and they'll say, well, see, therefore you have to have faith that I'm here. In the same sense that I have faith that Jesus levitated. They're trying to make the similarities there, but they don't cut it because, like you said, we can do all those things to test whether or not he's sitting in that chair. And if that's not good enough, nothing's going to be good enough. If all you want to say is that it's possible he wasn't sitting in that chair, like with the scenarios I just mentioned and the one there you mentioned, if all you want to say is that it's possible he's not sitting in that chair, then that gets you nothing, because we're not dealing with possibilities. We're looking for probabilities, and probabilities based on evidence. The pragmatic approach, the one that says that's the best possible way to get anywhere with truth, even if it might be wrong, is to say, well, look, let's test the evidence. Well, we do that, and the probabilities are he's sitting in that chair, even if it's possible he's not. Now, if faith is to be equated then with what's possible, then that's it, because that's all they've got. Faith then, by their own way of gerrymandering around words, is simply saying faith is about that which is possible. That is, it's possible that Jesus rose from the dead. It's possible he levitated. It's possible he was born.
It undermines their new definition.
It does, because then they are forced to admit that when we say faith in that sense, they're talking only about mere possibilities, not probabilities. Whereas you and I are talking about probabilities, and that just undercuts their whole definition of faith. I mean, the analogies don't work. If I must be worried about what's possible, then I must be worried about a lot of things that don't matter.
In the live chat last night, we were running out of time, so I didn't get a chance to field it, but someone in the live chat asked to the atheist in the room, what kind of evidence would you need to account for the resurrection story? I just wrote back, I said, we're running out of time, but let me just try to quickly answer. Tell me, I'll bounce this off you. We have a tool. What would we have? 3 tools for measuring the natural universe. The best one is the scientific method. Then we have mathematics, which is really good too, and philosophy, which is not as robust.
Yeah, right.
Okay, right? But it's still a tool. It's like that tool in your toolbox you don't use very often. Science is that wrench, that pair of pliers that you're always using. The scientific method. So that's our tool for measuring, observing, testing the natural universe. Humans don't have a tool for measuring, testing, or observing supernatural phenomenon. If we had a tool, we would use it. And just like Randall Theo said that last night, if you show us a method for determining, for testing and observing supernatural phenomenon, we're right there with you. If it's repeatable and falsifiable, we'll use the method. We'll add it to our toolbox.
Philosophy in your description there. Let's.
I downplayed it a little too much.
Well, no, you should. Let's use reasoning, and let's put those 2 words together: scientific reasoning, and you can dispense with philosophy.
Okay, yeah.
Scientific reasoning, because everybody reasons. That doesn't make them a philosopher. Philosophy. I wrote a book called The Unapologetic: Why Philosophy of Religion Must End, and philosophy has a content. It's that which philosophers talk about. They talk about everything, but certain schools of philosophers talk about certain topics. And philosophy of religion talks about religion topics, and mainly in America it's about Christianity, which is bullshit. I mean that gets precedence in American universities when there's all kinds of other religions and that aren't being talked about. Or why elevate them? Why treat them and their views as anything special? So I argue that philosophy of religion should go back into philosophy in general, because when we talk about the issues we talk about, we're actually talking about scientific reasoning. And I like to state that reasoning based on science, and science is based on evidence. Because if you just reason in the sky, we had talked about Calvinism. Was it you?
It was brought up last night.
And Calvinism has a theory of everything. I mean, really, you try to break through to a Calvinist, and they seem to have an answer for it. The answer is barbaric. That God wants to, send you to hell, and you were born to go there. But they have an answer, and as long as you can have a callous skin to accept that sort of answer, then they have an answer for everything. But what they need to do is they need to be brought to bear on the evidence. What does the evidence show you about human nature and what we really are like? We're really not as bad as it says. And I'm not saying I can convince them here with a few sentences, but it's the reasoning which reasons in a circular manner by building a castle in the sky that doesn't touch down on evidence is not the kind of philosophy or religion that I will grant.
Everyone's a philosopher, so I will disagree with you there, but not everyone's a good philosopher. The good philosophy if you look at philosophical papers, it's math. I mean, it's math problems. Everything's written in letters. It's mathematical problems.
Well, I dispute that. Right. Not everybody's a philosopher.
We're all amateur. We all think.
No.
We all attempt to reason.
We all reason.
Yes.
We all think, but we're not philosophers. Now, a philosopher, a particular guy with the title philosopher, is someone who has done some work in that's noted, or has a degree in it, or several degrees in it. You don't say we're all doctors then too. We're all pharmacists. We're all pro athletes. No, these are people who have earned the title. It's a title, and it's people who are recognized as experts in reasoning. Now, on given subjects in certain schools.
Peer-reviewed and published journals.
Yeah, well, how are you define a philosopher? It's not going to be some kid on the street there playing with the ball.
That's true. Well, I was leading into the Calvinism, which, when I look at the philosophical arguments for Calvinism, I don't see a God in there. I think it's injected later. But Calvinism closely, in my mind, mirrors what a lot of physicists, especially string theorists nowadays, with regard to the nature of time, how we as humans, we see time as this slowly moving arrow pointed in one direction, which may or may not be the case.
That's right.
It might be a loaf of bread that's already made, and we're just living slice to slice on a loaf that's already here.
It's crazy.
And it could go just as, the physics would work just as well going this direction, or stopping.
Yeah, crazy.
But doesn't that seem like Calvinism? It closely mirrors it sometimes. But I don't see a God in that. I don't think there needs to be a divine intelligence, because even maybe less so, because if it's always been there, what do they say about God? It's always been there. Well, why do we need God now? If time, beginning, end, and everything in it has always been there, and we're just realizing it moment to moment, that gives you even less of a reason for a God to start everything off.
I think the physics show us that time could be going in a different direction. It's just crazy. It's nothing that's predicted in the Bible. I mean, the God of the Bible, if you want to stick to the Bible, because Calvinists want to, doesn't tell us anything about science, doesn't tell us anything about how to discover that. We had to discover it on our own. I mean, look, and think about the kinds of things that we've discovered. Vaccines. We've discovered, anesthesia. That was a big thing when it came to Civil War days, when people had limbs that were cut off and they were suffering in pain. But no, God didn't do that for us. Or how to, that washing your hands is the best thing.
That was what I was getting to.
The best thing for
direct contradiction to what Jesus taught, even.
Yes, and so like this guy. If you want to talk science, if you want to think that science backs up the Bible, you're crazy. Almost, it's like, no, you look in the Bible for anything science that would actually help us, in our day-to-day living, and you don't find it. You don't find any prediction of it. You don't find how to figure it out. The light bulb, electromagnetism, space exploration, airplanes, anything to make us better life. So, no.
Well, John's got to get on a plane in a couple hours, so we will wrap it up. Thanks so much for showing up to the book club meeting last night, for indulging us and doing the interviews for Atheist Edge, and hope you come back.
Thanks so much. Thanks
All right. Now, remember last night I asked if the Christology were flipped. I don't know if Travis understood my question, but I was saying if the Christology was high from the get-go, I think it would give more legitimacy to the Gospels. That's what I was trying to get at. If John were the very earliest Gospel, it seems like it'd be way easier to defend. That's all I was trying to say last night.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
I mean, they have to deal with the evolutionary development of their theology. And here's what's more. See, these Gospels are dated, I don't know, it's really hard to date them. I mean,
65 to 105?
Yeah, let's go with that. Okay. We don't know what they looked like before then. We have no clue whatsoever what any gospel story would have looked like or heard if it was just oral tradition, which it was. We don't know what these stories started out being. All we know is that once it started in a gospel in, say, 65, it evolved to be more than it was what the first part of it was. So if you have a theology that's growing from 65 to 105, right? And we see it as clear as day in those four Gospels. How much growth did you see?
30 years prior to that.
How much growth did you see before that?
When it wasn't written down.
It's obvious that it grew.
It was a game of telephone, and it lasted 3 decades.
Well, and not only that, Mark's Gospel was one view, right? Let's say that of all the Christians in, say, 65, they all wrote down the Gospel, the things they heard, that, they wouldn't have done that, but let's just assume everybody in every city, or let's just say every city that had a church, decided to write their own gospel, like from what they've heard and preached. Paul come through town, he preached and stuff like that. So we'd have multiple numbers of gospels that could have been different. See, those gospels would most definitely have started out being different. Well,
what happened to those, John?
They didn't exist. Well, they didn't.
Up?
No, I'm saying they didn't exist.
Oh, okay.
But if they did exist, they may have existed.
They would have been disappeared.
Why? Because
if they were even there.
You send 2 reporters to cover 2 events, you're going to get 2 different stories. You match them up, and you'll find some details that are different, and some details that are the same. So from the get-go, we start with Mark's gospel. Well, we don't know what other gospels would have looked like if someone else had written one, say in a different time.
Qumran, Dead Sea.
Well, maybe, sure.
Those were other gospels, and they're totally different than the canon.
Jesus was a teacher of righteousness in those. Paul Vitz has a book where he argues that the reason why people become atheists is because of bad fathers who beat them, yelled at them, and was not a good father. And there's something that could be said about that.
Tighten it up.
Yeah.
There's something that could be said about that, because what happens, either divorce, some kind of tragedy where you lose a child, bankruptcy, accused falsely of something, then it can wake you up and say, well, wait a minute, let me just reconsider my arguments. That's the way it is. I mean, you can say, well, why weren't the arguments so good that no matter what happens in your life, you couldn't revisit them and come away with a different conclusion.
Well, they'll gladly accept people who become Christians through
and that's true too.
They prey on people in times of
they try,
but it doesn't work in reverse apparently.
You had some trauma in your life.
Who hurt you?
Yeah.
Well, and sometimes they're right. I mean, if everything is going right in someone's life, and they're part of a good Christian community of love, they feel love anyway, and if everything's good, like James, I mean, I don't know if he's got any problems or not, but when a tragedy hits, sometimes you just rethink things. That's all there is to it.
But why is atheism the default in wake of a tragedy like that? Because that's a truth claim. I can see you becoming a misotheist, still believing in God but hating him due to a tragedy, but I can't see you changing your entire worldview on a truth claim. That doesn't seem logical. No matter how bad things got, it wouldn't affect my ability to distinguish what I consider true.
Yeah, I don't know. There'd be some interesting studies to do on that, and where the tragedy. But tragedies jolt us all. You begin questioning, I think, everything in some regard. Now, I don't know if there are probably people who became believers because of tragedy. I mean, I think William Lane Craig makes a case of it. He says he tries to make a case of it that when there are hurricanes and tornadoes and volcanoes, they see a rise in belief, and so he really does make that argument. So I said, well, if that's the case, why doesn't God send more hurricanes, tornadoes, and volcanoes, eruptions? You know, it's like, well, yeah, that's a great way to get converts. Just send some more tragedy, you know.
You know, in prison, when you've run out of people that are got your back, you run out of friends in the real world, you go to the imaginary one. That's why belief goes way up if you go to prison.